In Isaiah chapter 14, and this chapter is dealing with the king of Babylon and Babylon's fall. In verses 12 through 20, which we had gotten down to, I titled this section, Babylon's Pride, the Reason for Her Fall. And in verse 12, he says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" Now then, everyone knows that Lucifer is Satan, right? No? No? We have been told that so many times through the years that it is simply assumed that Lucifer is Satan. I said when we entered into this a couple of weeks ago that you have to look at, you have to go back, and let me find it now, to verse 4. And it says, "Thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say," and then he goes into this proverb or this taunt against the king of Babylon. So we come down to this verse 12, and I'll just say any interpretation of this section which removes it from being and talking about the king of Babylon must be a false interpretation. That should seem fairly simple, that we all should be able to understand that and accept it. I don't know how many times, though, that I've even pointed this out to members of the church, and they still argue and fight that Lucifer is Satan. We get so caught up in that discussion, though, many times, that we miss what Isaiah is really saying. God is going to bring, and I'll go ahead and say the king, down from his exalted position. He's going to be cast down or cut down to the ground. Now then, Lucifer, of course, is not Satan. There is no allusion to Satan in the term Lucifer. I believe some of the latter-day translations don't even use the term anymore, Lucifer. American Standard has Daystar. I think the New King James used something along that line as well.
The New King James has a footnote, and on the footnote it says literally Daystar.
Okay, has a footnote on it that literally it is Daystar. That is the term, and Daystar or Morning Star would be the actual definition of the term that's translated by the King James, Lucifer.
Is Daystar Venus?
I don't know. As far as astrology, I don't.
No, I don't mean astrology. I mean astronomy.
Or astronomy, yeah. No, I don't know. That's what he was asking, if it was Venus. Okay. Bill?
In earlier times, when there was less pollution, you could see some of the planets during the day, in the daytime.
They were, and that would be true even today. If you get out in certain areas during the day, you can there are some of the stars that you can see because they're a little bit brighter in nature. As far as Satan, and just as a side discussion, since so many people believe that this has reference to Satan, is that the Bible does not deal with the origin of Satan. It deals with the existence of Satan, but not necessarily his origin. Thus, we are left to, what's the best word? Well, I thought about using speculate or a similar word. I thought maybe contemplate might be a better term as to his origin. We can discuss it, but I think a lot of brethren are so adamant, and they do not really or should not be as adamant as they should about his origin. If we're dealing with the origin of Satan, not simply his existence, there's only two possibilities. He is an eternal being, or he is a created being. That's the only alternatives that you have. If you take that he is an eternal being, then you have an eternal dualism between God and Satan, they both existing throughout all eternity. There's some problems with that view. If he is a created being, then you have the question, was he created good and became evil, or did God create him evil? Some have misused a passage in Isaiah to say that God created evil. The idea of evil there would not be sinful, but dealing with calamity. He brings punishment, calamity upon nations. The aspect of God creating evil certainly would present some major problems with the very nature of God himself. If God is holy, which he is, and cannot be tempted of evil, neither tempteth he any man, how could he create then evil? Create Satan as an evil being. That would be contrary to his very nature. So if he was a created being, then he had to be created good. And then he became evil. There's some problems with that view, even though that is the accepted view of the origin of Satan, that God created him as a being that is good, generally called an angel, and that he then became evil. He sinned. The problem is, and I'll just set forth the problem. I'm not trying to take a position as to the origin of Satan right now. The problem with that is, in relationship to man, Satan was there to tempt man. Where'd the temptation for Satan come from? You see, that's where's that temptation start? So that would be the problem with that view. That's why I say it's the accepted view, yes. It's the view that I think is true. But let's not be too confident to state without any equivocation that God created Satan good and he became evil. I think that's a good statement. There are aspects of that spirit realm, as you use the term, that we will never understand. God created the angels, obviously. Some angels sinned and were cast down into the pit or to Tartarus, 2 Peter chapter 2. Have you ever wondered why did they not have a chance to be redeemed? Have you ever wondered that? Well, that's the angels. You have a different set of angels that sin, though, and were cast down into Tartarus and are being kept there, reserved in chains until the day of judgment. Why aren't they given the chance to repent and turn away from it? I have my ideas as to why, but we don't know. There's a lot of that. When did God create the angels? We don't know. There's a lot that we don't know about that. As you read Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 4 in particular, these living beasts that are around the throne of God, who are they? We generally think that they are probably angels. But there's a distinction between them and angels in the book. I don't know. That's the problem. There's a lot in regards to the spirit world that we simply do not know. We cannot state for certain. We have some knowledge, just like the existence of Satan. We know he exists. Where'd he come from? Well, I don't know. I can't say for certain. I think, but emphasize that I think that he was created good and became evil, that he sinned. But do I know that? No. And if somebody wants to take that view that he was eternal, well, okay, there's some difficulties with that, but I'm not going to really argue that much against it. If they say that God created him evil, I've got some major problems with that because of the view it makes of God. So we go back to the aspect, God does not state where Satan came from. The Bible deals with his existence, not his origin. Now, Dale, you wanted to ask.
Who in the world, in the spiritual realm rather than the way I should say it, is that four-sided eagle lion, two other wheels on the bottom? That's something no man can figure out for sure. That's under the throne of God with a man up top, you know.
Are you talking about Ezekiel?
1:4-20 something.
Um,
Wow, very
in the figurative language that is used there.
four-sided one in Revelation 4 too. Wow, you got
There's a lot of those things that we do not understand. We don't know. Carl? Okay, Deuteronomy 29:29 applies to a lot of that, Carl.
Wasn't Satan referred to as a tempter?
Yeah. The tempter.
How do you know if something's going to work if you don't try it?
Where did his temptation come from? See, that's the problem that I have with that. He was created good and became evil. Where did his temptation come from? I don't know. Even though if I have to, that's the view I would accept. So he tempted her. And that's what he does with us. He tempts us. When you get to this aspect of Lucifer, the son of the morning, some have even suggested that this was a title that belonged to Christ. Someone turn over to Revelation 22 and verse 16. And what does he say there?
bright morning star.
And Jesus has set my angels to testify unto you these things to the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star.
The bright and morning star. And so they take this day star, son of the morning, and they then apply it to what is stated there in Revelation 22:16, that Jesus is the bright and the morning star. Now then, that's an incorrect interpretation, but some have done so. Others have assumed that this and Satan are the Antichrist that John speaks of so often in his writings. So you have, when you get to this verse, you have all of this wild speculation. And in reality, there's no need for it. When you go back to verse 4, what's he talking about? This is a proverb against Satan, right? Well, no, it's the king of Babylon. Why do we try to make it something else? Well, we're going to get to that in a minute. Look at verse 22 as well. For I will rise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and cut off from who? Babylon, the name and remnant. And so as you read this, and you go back to verse 4, you can read this in verse 22, and he surrounds it with, here's Babylon and the king of Babylon. Now, why would we think right in the middle of that, he's talking about something else? And so again, any interpretation of these verses that takes it from that context and that it's dealing with the king of Babylon is an improper interpretation. Now then, we might ask, which king of Babylon? The thing about it is, and this is the interesting point, or a point to me at least, what Isaiah says in these verses can apply or can refer to one or more of the kings, or different ones. for example, this that he's talking about, thou art fallen from heaven, Lucifer, the morning son of the morning, how art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? Turn over to Daniel, the 4th chapter. And let's read verses 28 through verse 37. And see if what we read in Daniel 4 does not parallel what Isaiah is saying here. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might and my power, and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and thou shalt drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till the hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. And at the end of days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes into heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou? At the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom and mine honor and brightness returned unto me. And my counselors and my lord sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol the honor the King of heaven, all whose works are true, and his ways judgment, that walk in pride he is able to abase. Notice that last statement, those that walk in pride he is able to abase. What's the difference between that and here's this, thou art fallen from heaven? Go back to the very beginning. He comes out and he says, look at this, my kingdom and what my power has done. He's basically exalting himself into heaven. And now then, what happens to him? He's brought low. He's cut down to the ground. And he's the one who is able to destroy, to weaken the nations. So it certainly can refer to Nebuchadnezzar. But now then, let's not stop there. Turn over to Daniel, the 5th chapter. And let's read verses 1 through verse 5. And another king of Babylon, Belteshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they were brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, and wood, and of stone. In the same hour came forth the finger of man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall and of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now then, skip down to verses 22 through verse 31. That same chapter, still talking about Belshazzar, the king of Babylon. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, thou hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. Now this is Daniel speaking to Belshazzar. He's reminded him, here's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And now then he says, you knew this, but you have not humbled thine heart, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of the house before thee, and thou and thy lord, thy wives, thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and of gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And God, in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. That is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now then, you knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. You didn't humble your heart. You've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. Now, could that which Isaiah is stating here, thou art fallen from heaven, he's lifted himself up against the Lord of heaven. You've fallen now from heaven. What happens? That night he dies, and his kingdom is divided between the Medes and the Persians. So he's been cut down to the ground. See, what Isaiah writes here can refer to either one of those kings. That's why he does not specify a king, possibly, and just says the king of Babylon. It's not speaking about a specific one king, but the king of Babylon being any of them, or a variety of them. Being cut down, he says, how art thou cut down to the ground, is kind of a favorite metaphor of Isaiah, and it's representing the death of a nation by the felling of a tree or a forest. So here the tree falls over, or it's cut down. And that tree representing, here's this nation, what has happened to it? It's fallen. It's been cut down. It does not exist. That's what's going to happen to Babylon. Babylon is like a brilliant star whose glory is now cut down to the earth. From the height of heaven and now then on the ground. And then, which this weakened the nations? Well, they had become a world empire. All of these kings and all of these nations that they overtook, they bowed down to the king of Babylon. They prostrated or made themselves low unto him. So they weakened those nations by defeating them in battle. So as we get to this verse now, just remember, anytime you hear those individuals who talk about Lucifer, you're not talking about, or the Bible is not talking about Satan. It's talking about the king of Babylon. Henry?
The day star that it refers to is the same as Lucifer. Would that be considered something or somebody that received a lot of attention or stood out?
I think when you're saying the king of Babylon, he is one who stood out. So yes. How much more could he stand out? Either one. He's outstanding. Well, he is the bright and morning star there in Revelation 22. So, yes. Here, though, it's dealing with, here's one who stood out, who is a bright star in relationship to the nations around them. He is, remember the Daniel 2 and the figure, a head of gold? What a marvelous idea that would be. Well, that was the king of Babylon. So here's, yes, the whole idea is showing his greatness, his power, how wonderful he is. My thing is, because of that pride, he's being cut down. In verse 13, then, for thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. Some, and this is going back to some discussions that I've had with individuals over Lucifer, when they start reading verse 13 and verse 14 and such, say, how could that refer to anyone other than Satan? Well, you don't understand figurative language. That's what Isaiah is using throughout his book, isn't it? And how can you understand anything in Isaiah without understanding figurative language? That's what he's using here. Context is, well, I'll use, context is king. If you don't keep things in context, you're going to destroy any meaning of the Bible. Now, it's been said, and it's not true, but it's been said, you improve anything by the Bible. If you take verses out of context, you can. Judas went out and hanged himself, didn't he? The Bible says, go thou and do likewise. So when are you going to go hang yourself?
Do it quickly,
Whatsoever, the Bible says, whatsoever thou doest, do quickly. So how many of you are going to go out and hang yourself and do it quickly? Well, obviously, that is an extreme illustration of taking things out of context to try and prove a silliness in this case. But anytime you start doing that, you're going to destroy the meaning of the Bible. You have to keep things in context. That's why I say you go back to verse 4. You go down to verse 22. It surrounds itself with the definition, it's the king of Babylon. Carl?
I always thought that it was like a reference, the same as when Jesus called Peter Satan for what he was thinking evil or going against God's word in Matthew 3. 8, when Jesus told him, turn me about and see me something, he used Peter and said, get thee behind me.
In Matthew 21. In Matthew 8:33.
Mark, I'm sorry.
Okay. Now that would make sense. Mark 8:33. Parallel is in Matthew 16. After Jesus has told them, I will build my church, he then starts telling them about that he's going to be going to Jerusalem and be crucified and be raised the third day. And Peter tells him, no, not so, Lord. And he tells him, get thee behind me, Satan, thou art an offense unto me. In that case, it would be that Peter's sentiment of this not happening to Jesus was the sentiment of Satan. And so, get thee behind me, Satan, it's the sentiment that Satan's would express. And you, Peter, are expressing that sentiment. In this, it wouldn't have any parallel to this in relationship to the king of Babylon and Satan. It's the king of Babylon exalting himself and his pride being lifted up, and God is going to take him down. God is going to destroy him. But in verse 13, for thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. So this is more than actual words. The king's thought is that he would ascend into heaven, and he would exalt his throne above the stars of God. And this is really a boast of egotism. Again, turn over to Daniel, the 4th chapter. And we'll read a shorter section that we read just a moment ago, verses 20 through 22. The tree that thou sawest, which grew, was strong, whose height reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and their fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O King, that art grown and become strong, for thy greatness is grown and reached unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. Now this is a description of here Nebuchadnezzar, and your power, your kingdom has grown and what? Reached unto heaven. Now, thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. Now, why is it difficult to understand that this in Isaiah 14:13 has reference to the king of Babylon? When you have an exact parallel, your kingdom is grown and reached unto heaven, and thy dominion to the ends of the earth. So here's the king of Babylon again, going to and thinking about that exaltation of himself and his kingdom and the power of it. The mount of the congregation in the sides of the north has been explained by some as being the temple in Jerusalem, and thus Mount Zion. A problem with that is that the Babylonians had desolated it. So why would the king of Babylon want to go there and sit there? Doesn't make sense. It's been destroyed. Also, this would have to be above the stars of God and above the heights of the clouds, which would not have applied to the temple. Now, this is a lengthy reading, but the pulpit commentary says this about this phrase, that it is a mythic mountain belonging to the Babylonian theosophy, was therefore seen to be intended, even before the times of cuneiform decipherment. Now that the Babylonians' inscriptions in the cuneiform was their writing in the early times, so now that the Babylonian inscriptions can be read, it is found that there was such a mount called that's I-M, Karshak, K-H-A-R-S-A-K, or Karsakak, Karsak Kara. Really good name, pronunciations of these names, but which is described as the mighty mountain of Bel, whose head rivals heaven, whose root is the holy deep, and which, quote, was regarded as the spot where the ark had rested and where the gods had their seat, end quote. Goes on to say, in Babylonian geography, this mount was identified either with the peak of Rowandiz or with Mount Elwind, near Ecbatana in the sides of the north. Both Elwind and Rowandiz are situated on the northeast of Babylon. A position, according to ancient ideas, might be described indifferently as north and east. So in the sides of the north. Talking about thus possibly these mountains, Elwind and Rowandiz. And probably our mountain climber over here would love to climb them, but he might even know how to pronounce them. You don't want to take a shot at that. Okay, well, I tried, so. But basically, he's saying, or the pulpit commentary was saying, that these things were identified even long before the Bible writings and the cuneiform writings of these mountains that basically are identified by what we would see here, that the king of Babylon saying, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. So this elevated mountain that would be near them, or a mythical mountain next to them. So we'll start with verse 14, Lord willing, next week.